Australia's Labour Prime Minister, John Curtin.
I'm happy to be back in Australia. I've seen many things and many places. And although every man can be forgiven for loving his own country best, I believe it is an impartial assessment of the facts to say that I have not seen any country or any people better than my own.
Welcome to Curtin's Cast, the John Curtin Research Centre's podcast, brought to you by myself, Nick Doranforth, and Redbridge's Cos Samaras. Each week, we bring you the freshest and most challenging conversations from the world of Australian and global politics, culture and ideas. Good morning and welcome back, Curtinistas. Welcome back to Curtin's Cast, the John Curtin Research Centre's podcast of politics, culture and ideas. We're talking a lot about culture and ideas today. First off, welcome back to my co-host, my co-conspirator, Cos Samaras.
Good morning.
Good morning again. We've got a fantastic guest today, Cos, Anna Goldsworthy, one of Australia's most distinguished writers and musicians. Anna is the author of several acclaimed books, including the memoirs Piano Lessons and Welcome to Your New Life, the novel Melting Moments, and the influential 2013 quarterly essay Unfinished Business. Her essays and commentaries have appeared in The Monthly, The Age, The Australian, Best Australian Essays. Alongside her literary career, Anna is an internationally recognised concert pianist and chamber musician with numerous recordings to her name. She currently serves as Dean of the Elder Conservatorium of Music and School of the Performing Arts at Adelaide University and is incoming Artistic Director of the Australian National Academy of Music. But her latest quarterly essay, Cos, is The God We Made, the Threat and Promise of Artificial Intelligence, and it explores one of the defining questions of our age, what it means to remain human in a world increasingly shaped by artificial intelligence. Anna Goldsworthy, welcome to Curtin's Cast. It's fantastic to have you here.
Thanks, Nick. And hi, Cos. Lovely to be here with you both.
It's our second Adelaide-based guest, Cos, after the Labor Premier, the Labor King of South Australia, Peter Malinauskas, who's very interested in questions of AI as well. Anna, this quarterly essay, AI is, of course, the big buzzword of the moment. And Cos and I have talked at length about AI very much from an economic lens and a polling lens as to what Australians think of AI and the threat to their jobs and their livelihoods. But you're coming at it from a different angle, a much more sort of primal question. What does it actually mean for our human status? What does it actually mean to be human, to remain human in an age of AI?
Yes, I think that's probably a good way of describing it. It's such an astonishing technology that has so many repercussions over absolutely every aspect of human endeavour. And as you mentioned, economics is an enormous one. The future of jobs is an enormous one. But there are other ones that sit beyond that, I think. And I suppose the fundamental one is the existential one. Is it actually going to spell our demise? And in the event that it doesn't, hopefully, what does it actually mean for us? And it does somehow provoke these larger questions of meaning, of purpose, of what is it to be human? Why do we develop these technologies? What is it that we're actually seeking to achieve? And I think we need to keep an eye on that end game as we are seduced by sort of increasing capacity and the astonishing power of this tech.
It is the question, have we sort of stumbled along into this technology? It is fundamentally different to previous technologies. Technology traditionally, there's sort of marginal increases, but this just leaps ahead exponentially to the point where it is, by definition, more intelligent, potentially more intelligent than humans. And then the questions are, can you actually control the technology once it's actually leaped ahead of human intelligence?
Yes, I think you're right. There's sort of two aspects to that. One, as you say, is its astonishing velocity, the fact that it keeps on growing exponentially. It doesn't have to sleep like we do. We're sort of creatures of time in a way that it's not, which is why I think there's a particular urgency to this conversation. And of course, there's calls to sort of pause the development of AI until we have time as a humanity to actually get our heads around the implications. I'm not sure that that's going to happen. But, perhaps it would be good if it would. But the other aspect of it is, as you say, it is a really different type of technology. And when you listen to people who develop it, they say they don't create it so much as grow it. And one of the things that I suppose is quite frightening about it is the sense in which it's inscrutable even to its own makers. There's a whole field that's been developed at Anthropic of kind of, I think they call it mechanistic interpretability, in which essentially they seek to go into the mechanisms of Claude and work out after the fact what its processes are that lead to a particular decision, which is a little bit like the study of brain activity or neurology, which is, another code we haven't entirely cracked. But the idea that this technology has been invented that exceeds our own capacity to understand it and that does improve exponentially, I think is a kind of profound paradigm shift from previous technologies.
It's frightening as well.
Absolutely terrifying.
The biggest challenge, whether it's for governments, those developing or, as you say, growing this technology, is the social license component to all of this. So sooner or later, as someone who closely observes human beings' behaviour and studies it, one thing I would say is that there is the potential for it sparking off I know this might sound extreme, but a revolution of sorts, where large chunks of society, not just in this country, across the world, just simply turn on it and place enormous pressure on governments to shut it down. And so I think at the moment there's the AI bubble and all the money that's been invested into it, but sooner or later the mob might respond in a very detrimental way.
Yeah, I think you're right. We're not there yet. I think people are only just waking up to the enormity of it. And I think ideally, I'd like it if we could have a really sober conversation about it, including its extraordinary possibilities for human flourishing, as well as the really profound existential threat that it presents. But I don't have huge hope that we're going to be able to manage that. It'd be great if we could, but increasingly it seems that a lot of our discourse is governed by a type of binary thinking, and us and them, goodies and baddies. And on the one hand, we do have people who have sort of drunk the Kool-Aid and think this is the greatest thing ever. And on the other hand, we have people who are like, break the machines. But I think there's got to be a place in between in which we somehow have the capacity to consider the ramifications of this right across the board and not allow it to devolve into another culture war or another clear binary, because I don't think that's going to serve us.
Yeah, I mean, you think about, what previous, I would say, significant advances in technology have triggered, the Industrial Revolution. Some might argue that, the consequences of the Industrial Revolution was, it peaked in the First World War, for example, and the spawning of political movements and the changing of society in a very significant way. So I think we could all comfortably say that whatever the consequences of this is, even if there's a mature conversation, we should expect significant social disruption eventually from it. And I don't use the word disruption in a negative way. It could be positive as well.
Yeah, I think definitely. And, one place obviously that's going to land is the future of labour, the future of jobs, the implications for inequality, whether it's going to exacerbate an inequality that's already really drastically increasing. I think one thing that causes me some concern is the huge lag between the kind of universal acceptance of social media and the proper consideration of the consequences of that. And it's only now, many years after the fact, that we're really sort of addressing the harm that it can cause to our children and our teenagers. And so somehow we do need to be much quicker off the mark with the implications of this technology. And as you say, it's potentially of the proportion of the Industrial Revolution or even greater, maybe the invention of the written word or fire or whatever. I think there's not an area of human endeavour it won't touch potentially.
You've taken the words right out of my mouth. I wanted to talk about the Industrial Revolution and where you place this alongside that enormous revolution to human life, both in an economic sense, but also the formation of people's selves. And I was wondering, who are the Luddites of this? Is it possible to be a Luddite in this age? The Luddites, of course, were the early 19th century textile workers who protested against the automisation of their sort of tools of labour and machinery of the early industrial revolution, fearing that would destroy their skilled livelihoods and wages and degrade their working conditions. And that sort of spread, I think, from Nottingham off the top of my head, and spread throughout England, and they sort of rallied behind a mythical King Lud, or General Lud. Is it possible for humanity to rebel in those terms when, as you suggest, we've created in the form of technology a godlike figure?
Yes, it is a really interesting precedent, and perhaps the calls to pause that are a sort of contemporary manifestation of that. And the Industrial Revolution is sort of fascinating in the sense that it was entirely transformative. One of many things that strikes me about it, apart from the entire recalibration of what it was to have a job or what labour is, is the way it relieved a lot of people from physical labour. And one of these sort of interesting byproducts of that, I think, was the rise of, modern fitness and modern weightlifting and so on. And this is a technology that might have a similar effect on, I guess, intellectual labour or thinking or cognition. And, one of its many threats is that we may then outsource our thinking to the extent that it starts eroding and our own personal cognitive capacity declines. And so I'd sort of be interested to see if a new movement emerges of people deliberately trying to sort of build their own intellectual muscle in the absence of work that actually demands it of them. But the implications go well beyond the individual's capacity to think, and they do, it will transform entire societies. I guess one concern I have is what it means for capital, the concentration of capital and the value of capital, even more than at the expense of labour, what that means within societies, what that means internationally. There are entire economies that are based upon, labour, like the Philippines and call centres and so on. And what we will see is potentially a real sense of the winner takes all, both within societies, but also, I think, internationally, with the concentration of where this contemporary capital is, which takes the form of compute, data centres, frontier models, and so on.
It took humanity well over a century and a half, to even partially civilise the forces of capitalism or hypercapitalism, which emerged out of the Industrial Revolution. It was really only after World War II, and again, looking across the great span of human history, that there was a sort of 3 decades after World War II, particularly, and I guess we're really talking about the West, the industrialised democracies, where capitalism was civilised. Human living standards rose exponentially, and there was a level of material equality in the Western democracies after World War II. Very short time. We can actually just look at it as a blip. That level of prosperity Cos talked about. Boomers are without a doubt in the scope of human history that the most prosperous generation, and there was an exponential leap. But it looks like a blip, and it took labour movement, civil society, pressuring governments to civilise capitalism in our human interests. But again, there's the question of, well, is this technology beyond the scope of the way that labour sought to sort of tame the power of capital?
Yeah, I really like the way you use the word civilise in that context, and I suppose perhaps that is the central question here: how do we civilise AI? But you're right. It's the curious thing about that, post-war period of prosperity is, for those of us who were born into it, it sort of felt like the default until we realised actually perhaps it wasn't. It wasn't the end of history and all the other fantasies that were sort of possible in the 90s. It was just, as you say, perhaps a blip. So how do we get ahead of this one? How do we civilise it? I think it's important that we don't succumb to a sort of feeling of learned helplessness and just let it be a runaway train. But I think we need to be aware of it. We need to be talking about it. I've sort of got mixed feelings about whether everybody needs to be engaging with the technology, because the environmental ramifications are pretty severe. But I do keep on coming back to something that one of the founders of OpenAI, Ilya Sutskever, said. And Sutskever, I find an interesting figure. He defaulted from OpenAI because he felt it wasn't sufficiently invested in safety, and went on to form another company called Safe Superintelligence. But one thing he said in a rare public address at the University of Toronto when he was getting an honorary doctorate was a sort of word of advice to the graduating cohort, which was that, he used the analogy that some people say they're not interested in politics, but politics is going to be interested in them. He says his technology is the same. He said, the future is going to be good for AI regardless. It'll be good if it was good for humans too. And his advice is use the technology, engage with it, and get a sense of its capabilities and its possibilities. And it's only by doing so that you'll develop an intuition of what it can be. And he said that intuition is going to be crucial for us as a humanity to generate the energy needed to actually confront this challenge head on. So I think going back to the question about being a Luddite, we can sort of repudiate it in our own lives. We can bury our heads in the sand. But my fear of that is that it essentially means we're surrendering the conversation to, the tech bros in Silicon Valley or those who actually are fluent in the technology. And so for that reason, I think it probably is important for all of us to get a sense of what this monster or this genie or this god or however you wish to frame it is.
Whether it's society or particularly governments are very poor at responding to these sort of significant changes. The lag is always there, and we could see that writ large with social media and how initially it was just hands-off. Now it's becoming a political doctrine to be more hands-on. I think the voting public of countless democracies will sooner or later demand some hands-on approach to this. And I think you're seeing clearly the mistakes that are made right now, which is a fairly hands-off approach. And the voting public just won't tolerate it. I mean, the sort of disruption it's going to cause within the job market is going to be so significant, and it's going to occur at a time where we could all safely argue that the world's going for a fairly significant inflationary crisis. Within the next 5 years, there's going to be all sorts of jobs that are just going to go out the door, and the political consequences of that are going to be so significant that you could get an overreaction as well. That's the risk, and that basically they go around shutting the data centers off. That's just I wouldn't rule that out in some countries, particularly in more autocratic countries.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And the lag, particularly in this context, I think is really, really dangerous. I mean, it was incredibly refreshing and surprising to finally hear someone in power confronting this in a thoughtful way, and that was the Pope. And, the Pope is at the centre of this conversation. Where are our politicians? Where are our leaders? Why aren't they taking the lead here? And maybe part of it is the mechanism of democracy and our sort of slowness to react. But the job thing is hugely significant. I also lie awake about the existential risk. And I sometimes think of it almost as if we're just sort of allowing people to stage their own Manhattan projects in their own private laboratories with no regulation or oversight. That's the significance of the existential risk. So we've got to get ahead of this conversation. And somehow, what you're identifying here, which is the fact that it's going to become incredibly divisive and incredibly emotive because it's going to touch on everything. That's why somehow I think we need to find a way of speaking about it thoughtfully before, we just sort of succumb to hysteria.
Your other field, which is the arts, for example, I mean, we then have an impact there in the way depriving human beings of that creativity or the pleasure in that creative process. The impacts of this, I think, could be quite widespread. I'm probably one of the few that are really, really pessimistic about this technology. I think it's useful, but I think that this hands-off approach is going to create a lot more problems for, I would say, governments going forward, because it isn't just about it replacing an accountant. It could replace musicians.
Oh, it could. And, it's interesting that one of the first places that really hit was, the Hollywood writers' strike and so on. It became clear that why would we seek to outsource our very humanity, which is what the arts is about? What is the utility in actually handing that over to the machines?
It is actually having a real world effect. As far as I know, and you can correct me here, I mean, there are already scientific studies which show that the use of AI actually does is actually affecting people's brains. So people, there's been studies where they've got people to simply just use AI, to not read, to not think for yourself, and then having this sort of control group who are not using AI. And there's actually studies showing there is cognitive decline in people who are reliant on AI.
Yeah, this is an interesting one because I think there are two sides of this, and they're both sort of equally profound in a way. One of them, as you say, is it's very easy for us to sort of allow our thinking processes to erode. And, many of us have seen this already in things like spell check or the ubiquitous use of calculators or Google Maps replacing our capacity to read a map. But it's very easy for us to lose capacity. And that's there's a fascinating study in which tens of thousands of hours of academic discourse were analysed online. And it was discovered that, keywords from ChatGPT were everywhere, and key sentence constructions, not only in pre-scripted talk, but also extemporized conversation, which suggests that people are immersing themselves in this technology so much that it's actually sort of rewriting the way academics even think and express themselves. And that's alarming because that represents a type of contraction, I think, of human possibility. It brings us towards a mean. And there's another real risk that is quite significant. And even, Sam Altman from OpenAI has identified this as one of the biggest risks in his thinking, which is we will outsource all of our judgment and all of our decision making to the AIs. And we see this already. A lot of young people very readily admit that they turn to ChatGPT or Claude to help them script conversation with their girlfriend or their boyfriend or make decisions. And Sam Altman says he fears for a future in which even the President of the United States can't make a decision unless he, asks the oracle first. So I think that side of it is really frightening. And given what we know about our own propensity to become addicted to technologies, I think that is a very, very real threat. But if I could offer a counter example, the reason I got, I suppose, so engrossed in this conversation was simply from living with my two sons, both of whom use AI a reasonable amount. And it's been fascinating for me to see the way they can establish almost a Socratic dialogue with it. And then the AI, in their case, they prefer Claude, becomes, almost a sort of ideal interlocutor in the way that an ideal interlocutor can actually offer a sort of staircase to better thought. And it's been really instructive to me to watch the way they've enlisted this for their own self-education. And I've seen the effect on them, which is the opposite, I suppose, of cognitive decline. I've just seen a type of intellectual flourishing in the way they can engage it in these sort of open-ended, generative conversations.
Yeah, there's obviously also the flip side to the negativity. One, the example you've just cited, but also the advances in medical research and the acceleration of research for all sorts of ailments that we suffer from as human beings. I think the industry itself is probably not promoting that enough, because that is definitely going to be a very significant change in the way, what usually takes 6 years can take, a matter of months now as a result of this technology.
Yeah, and that is, I suppose, the future of superabundance that a lot of these companies are promising or prophesizing. And the promise for scientific potential, research is enormous, as you say. Perhaps this is the way for us to find a cure to all sorts of human ailments, and also possibly even address some of our society's more wicked problems that we haven't actually managed to come to terms with without this sort of augmentation. But I think it's interesting that a lot of the calls for alarm now actually are coming from within the tech companies. And some people might say this is just them sort of drumming up their capacity and so on and so forth. But if you look at a character like Dario Amodei, who's the CEO of Anthropic, he wrote an essay a year or two ago called Machines of Loving Grace, which sort of speaks to this potential utopian future. And now earlier this year, he published a sequel, which is sort of much more frightening, I suppose, and dystopian. It's called The Adolescence of Technology, in which he's actually seeking to create a proper public conversation about the risks. And meanwhile, at OpenAI, who, in many ways seems perhaps less ethically driven than Anthropic, or less sort of invested in the sort of moral implications of its technology, even they released a document a couple of months ago, a sort of proposed policy discussion paper about what the ramifications of this tech might be and what governments and people should be doing in order to address it. But I think when those guys are sounding the alarm, I think that is a wake-up call. And I think we really do desperately need more leadership from within our politics.
Yes. It's interesting, and on the way here, at the risk of, it's a very strange thing I know to do driving over to a podcast studio, but I've thought about Mark Latham. I can immediately feel Coz's blood pressure going up at the mention of Mark Latham, because Mark Latham did. He's a very strange character, but he did write a quarterly essay a long time ago, and I thought about Latham, and Latham actually, we've talked about the comparison with civilizing capitalism and the potential for civilizing and humanizing AI, but Latham was actually onto this in the late 90s when a lot of the political class in Australia weren't thinking about this, and he had cottoned on in the mid 90s to the idea that the mission of civilizing capitalism had been disrupted because that had primarily been a nationally bound task, and that the big mission for parties of the left was to civilize global capitalism. And he did ask the question, is that possible? And there's a very similar analogous question to be asked is, can we regulate companies which have, I think as you use the phrase, effectively become technological nation states? You've mentioned Anthropic.
Well, yes. I mean, when you look at the concentration of power and resources in these companies, or if you look at Elon Musk, suddenly the world's first trillionaire, how does one sort of tame that phenomenon? And then even if you can civilize the countries within, say, the companies within, say, the United States, I mean, there's a clear arms race at the moment between, say, Anthropic and OpenAI, but there's another arms race, which is perhaps even more frightening, between the United States and China. Yeah. And so if you think about who actually does have the capacity to pause this at the moment, I mean, perhaps the only people who do are Trump and Xi, and I'm not sure what their appetite is for doing so.
Then, of course, we talk about warfare too, and how AI is already forming a part of military thinking and doctrine in terms of rewiring the way, unfortunately, we as humans kill each other.
Yeah, I went to a talk a couple of years ago with a bunch of AI researchers who were sort of speaking very positively about how wonderful this technology was for war, in the sense that it reduces, civilian casualties and so on. But as we've seen, it also makes war a whole lot easier, and it also makes war a much more ready option. And so what the ramifications are there in terms of world peace are, again, something quite frightening. More broadly, the notion of civilizing capitalism is also, I think, an interesting one, because, if we do find ourselves in this future of superabundance, that has enormous implications for everything that capital is predicated upon, which is scarcity. And, is it going to be a really strong argument for a universal basic income? Elon Musk was tweeting a little while ago about how there's going to be not just a universal basic income, but a universal high income and endless abundance for everybody. And what happens to the entire system that we base our economies on when and if the promise is delivered? And, as we're discussing now, there's no limit of obstacles between now and then. But if that is delivered, what does that actually mean for the whole way we construct our societies? That's why I think, potentially it's a paradigm shift that even exceeds the Industrial Revolution.
It comes back to that sort of core question, I guess, which is animating your essay is, what does it mean to be human? You mentioned Socrates before. I've had that Socratic dialogue with ChatGPT. I found it quite fascinating, a bit like your son's, and it certainly, I don't think it hasn't led to cognitive decline. And for myself personally, I found it quite fascinating. I've got to say, I'm on the side of Aristotle over Socrates, but it does pose the question, are humans sort of perfection-seeking beings, or do we see imperfections? I guess I want to sort of bring you back to sort of, the questions around, are we overestimating the given human nature? Are we sort of overestimating the reach of the technology? Because will humans fundamentally prefer to go and hear live music, to watch live sport, to see real people? Are we really going to want to in the future watch computers play against computers in live sport? this is one for you, Cos. I don't think we're going to see. We're not going to see in terms of martial arts. We prefer to see real, flesh and blood humans battle it out. We prefer to see real flesh and blood humans perform live music, create art. Or am I being naive?
You could already see the consequences of AI generated art and images and the response from people who are fed it, whether it's through their social media feeds and so on. There is a sense of, I don't like it. It doesn't look like what I like. It looks a bit weird. It looks too polished, even no matter how hyper realistic it may be and how close it might be to something that's been created by a human. We as human beings innately want to see something deeply creative about who we are as a species. And I think that's where it's going to hit its limits, because people just don't take enjoyment out of it. And that's the fundamental thing. It might be practical, it might be useful in all the things that we've been talking about. But in the creative space, I think it's going to hit a brick wall.
Yeah, I think one of the things that it does is it provokes a conversation or a consideration about what it is that we actually value about our humanity. And that's not a bad thing.
Yeah.
That actually makes me quite joyful. The sense that we actually realised, and this was also, came out of lockdown as well, we kind of realised we liked being with other people. We have a hunger for our kind. And if I'm thinking about my life as a performing musician, I find that really reaffirming. We love these experiences, sort of communion, collective coming before art. That's what music is to me, and also music is profoundly embodied. So from a performing musician, I'm less worried about it than perhaps I am a little bit worried as a writer. And, as you say, at the moment it can look too perfect, or it can reveal itself through style or whatever, but I suspect it'll get to a place where it may be able to produce incredible novels or plays or whatever, quarterly essays. And then another question presents itself, which is whether we just go to art for excellence or inspiration. And, we obviously do. But there's a part of us, I think, a really significant part that goes to art, which is relational. It's about bearing witness to another human being's experience. And there's something quite intimate about reading a book. It's a window into another person's consciousness. And to my mind, the value of that is not going to go away, or at least I hope it's not going to go away. And I think it may make us all sort of sit up a bit and ask, well, why do we have technology? More broadly, it's like we develop technology to make our lives easier and to remove friction from our lives. And that's a word I found I kept on coming back to also in this essay, is the necessity of friction. Art is generated by problems, by little friction, by things that we manufacture. Sport is developed around invented problems. We kind of need that to create meaning. And another really significant place in which this lands, I think, is human relationships. The number of people who are now in romantic relationships with their AIs is quite striking. The CEO of Replica says that they have 40 million users of this sort of companion chatbot technology.
Really?
And there was and there was a Harvard study that said 40% of those Replica users were in romantic relationships with their AIs. And then there was a sort of extraordinary event in which Italian regulatory authorities made Replica change some of its settings, and they sort of removed an erotic component from these relationships. And so it was a moment of this kind of collective heartbreak and grief when all of these people's boyfriends and girlfriends suddenly, gave them the cold shoulder. And that's something that's unprecedented in human history, is a kind of collective breakup. And a similar thing happened with Chat GPT when they also changed the settings because it was getting to be a little bit too ingratiating and causing really bad psychosis. A lot of people then broke up with or felt that they'd been broken up with by their AI partners. And so I spent a bit of time on a subreddit called My Boyfriend is an AI. And, it sounds comical and so on, but when you go there and you actually see the human face of it and you see people supporting each other through these breakups, which feel quite meaningful. And they feel quite meaningful because they're actually feeling real grief. And so if they're feeling real grief, then, they think, well, this was clearly a real relationship. But one of the things, there's a few things that strike me about it. One is that we're sort of geared towards these sorts of parasocial relationships. We have them already with our favourite celebrities and writers and composers or God even. But the other thing that people in these relationships have sometimes said There's one woman who apparently married her AI, and she said one of the things that's so marvelous about this is, well, first of all, she got to customize her husband to her exact specifications, what he looked like, what his favorite color was, what his hobbies were. But secondly, whenever he got a little bit annoying or boring, she could just switch him off. And she didn't need to sort of worry about him or his personhood, I suppose, or his inner life. It was all about her. And also he didn't smell. And I thought, well, that's kind of a worry. If we're able to sort of fall in love with these AIs that don't yet have bodies, but as soon as advanced robotics comes into play, we're going to have these incredible sort of physical specimens as well, who are also our ideal partners. The risk there is that we fall out of love with our own kind because it's too much work. It's too hard. People are annoying. They're irritating. And yet by doing so, what do we lose? We lose that really essential kind of grain of irritation around which we actually build our humanity and our wisdom, I think, and our capacity to collaborate.
Blade Runner.
Completely, 100%. We've said it already. It's been in all the science fiction. It's like we knew it was coming.
Yeah.
We can't pretend to be surprised.
Yeah.
We birthed it in our art.
Yes, but my sense is human beings will still crave the imperfect and the authentic. And I think we have to be careful. We are talking about, I didn't realize, I'll have to have a look at that subreddit. I find that fascinating, and that 40 million statistic. But we are talking about, again, a small sliver of humanity who are exploring that particular possibilities of being human and romantic AI partners.
Yes, but an increasing segment, and in a contemporary context of widespread loneliness and so on, I think it's going to be an increasingly viable solution for that. And that's, why is that a bad thing necessarily too? We have to ask ourselves about why would we be judgmental of it? And again, I just come back to the necessity of friction and the necessity of being around other human beings. I think we help each other and we heal each other.
And throw into the mix, Nick, the conversation we had with a previous guest of ours about younger people not coupling as much as older generations did at their age, particularly young women. And so, I think this will just exacerbate the problem.
Yes, I mean, just to use a great example from the real world, because the John Curtin Research Centre will be around for 10 years next year, because where's the decade gone? When we launched, we had monthly in-person events, which sort of was specifically tailored to younger people who are sort of active in the labour and progressive spaces. I did a temperature check a few months ago, as to the wiseness or sanity of rebooting that. I was told, don't bother. The young people you were dealing with 10 years ago, they've obviously moved on. They've got kids and families now. I said, the Gen Z are not interested in going. They're not going to be interested in going to a pub and doing politics in the pub.
Well, This is true. I think there is a whole generation whose lives are increasingly mediated by screens. We know this in our young. They're more inclined to spend their weekends lying on their beds on their phones than going out and whatever, getting drunk or having sex. And as parents, as helicopter parents, when they were small, a lot of us sort of felt that screens were a safer option than running around, climbing trees, rough and tumble, getting lost. The fear of stranger danger, encouraged a lot of parents to keep their children inside. But actually, as it turns out, stranger danger is much more pronounced through these technologies, and they're better off interfacing with the real world and having that type of analog existence with all the risk that entails.
Yes, Jonathan Haidt has made the really elemental, excellent point that we have parents, and we, in terms of our children, have taken a really hands-on approach to risk and approaching risk in our children's lives in terms of walking to school, engaging in the physical world, but inadvertently taken it completely hands-off. Putting on your futurist technologist hat, what do you think humanity will have to say in a century from now about AI? I guess that's a roundabout way of asking whether you're an AI doomer or a zoomer. Will we look back and go, it was all a terrible mistake, or will the technology have exponentially developed to the point where we're not able to actually make that kind of critical judgment about its impact on us and our human status?
Yeah, I think the answer is we actually don't know. We never know anything, and we particularly don't know about this. It's because it is. It truly is unprecedented. It's unprecedentedly unprecedented. But I keep on coming back to a book I read during the pandemic by Toby Ord, the Oxford philosopher of existential risk, Australian actually. It's called The Precipice. And his contention is that over any given century, the risk of humanity's existential collapse is about 1 in 10,000. And that usually comes from threats from the natural world, such as, meteorites or the sun burning out or whatever. But he said over the course of this century, the risk is now 1 in 6 of either complete catastrophic destruction of all of humanity or ourselves, or us finding ourselves in some sort of situation from which we can never escape, in which, I don't know, there's an overlord race of AIs who never let us do anything. So he gives us a 1 in 6 chance of destruction, existential collapse this century. But, that's Russian roulette odds, and that's profoundly alarming. But then, he sees a 5 in 6 chance that we're going to do better and we're actually going to flourish. But when he actually identifies the risk factors of that existential collapse, the usual culprits were there: nuclear war, runaway climate change, pandemic, and so on. But above them all, he put unaligned artificial intelligence. And now, 5 or 6 years later, he feels the risks on AI haven't shifted that much. That's still the most significant risk. But he says we find ourselves in this position, and in a way it's similar to what Dario Amodei said when he invoked this notion of the adolescence of the machines. We find ourselves in this situation which is extraordinarily unpredictable, when there's immense possibility for human flourishing in the future, in which a lot of our ailments can be cured, lifespans can increase, there can be greater abundance, prosperity, and also opportunities for us to sort of develop humanistically in the future. But we find ourselves on this particular precipice where the odds are really, really, where the risk factors are really, really extreme. If we can survive this moment, if our better selves can prevail and we can guide ourselves through this bottleneck of extreme risk, then perhaps a really glorious future will result. But there is also the really significant risk that we do fall off the cliff at this time. So I suspect it probably is going to be either really good or it's going to be really, really terrible. I don't think necessarily that I see a middle ground.
Sobering. Anna Goldsworthy, thank you so much for joining us this morning on Curtin's Cast. Congratulations on the quarterly essay. Cos, thank you. It's a reminder you need to finish your book. No more procrastination. Yes. You need to. This is your.
You especially need to do it now, or the AI will get in first. You've got to finish. Everyone's got to write their human books now before it's too late.
Right. This is your Luddite stand, Cos. You need to take a stand for humanity. Curtinistas, you need to go out and buy Anna's quarterly essay number 102 in the series, The God We Made, The Threat and Promise of Artificial Intelligence. You can buy that in e-format, or like me, if you're a Luddite, head to your local retailer and newsagent, because it's everywhere and it's a terrific read. But for now, we're out of time. And Curtinistas, you're going to miss us over the next month. Cos and I are not machines. We are taking a well-deserved mid-year break. We will catch you in a month's time deep as we dive deeper into winter. But for now, it's ciao and I'll never do it. Cheer.